The first question I have relates to electric vehicles in Scotland. The number of public charging points for electric vehicles is currently around 2,200. The consensus seems to be that Scotland will need to have around 30,000 public charging points by 2030 to support the expected increase in electric vehicles. Earlier this year, the Scottish Government announced that it will provide up to £60 million to local authorities over the next 4 years to support the rollout of public charging points for electric vehicles.
The important thing here is there's a world of difference, both in terms of performance and in terms of the commercial position between, for example, relatively low-speed chargers. We've heard a lot about converting lampposts, for example, to be chargers for vehicles that are parked overnight, and rapid chargers that might be fitted in specific rapid charging hubs that look perhaps remarkably like service stations as we think of them today. Actually, an electric car can be a great option if you're living in a rural area where you can have charging at home, but there is a big issue ongoing about the reliability of the chargers that are installed. So it's undoubtedly the case we're going to need more. We're going to need a mix of slow and fast, rapid chargers in hubs that are convenient for people, encouragement for people who can have electric vehicles at home and charge them at home to do so, and perhaps to encourage them particularly in rural areas where actually going electric can be more convenient and more cost effective than sticking with fossil fuels.
As Steve said, in terms of driveways and outside their properties, and then also the role that businesses play in terms of the locations where vehicles will ultimately access energy. And that's how we would break it down. It's when Scots have looked at this, we're consider it in the same terms as, well, how does a vehicle currently access petrol and diesel?
I mean, when I listen to these committees, or even when you listen to the government themselves, especially Nicola Bulcott-Thinlips talking to no end about decarbonisation, net zero, you hear that in passing and you might not necessarily read too much into it or think too much about it. But fundamentally, in order for them to actually achieve these targets, as fucking nonsensical and ludicrous as they really are, in terms of transportation, no cars, no motorbikes at all. No vans even, potentially. No lorries. Nothing like that at all will be on the roads. That's what's coming. And you could make the argument that we're already in that position now in terms of them making it financially unfeasible to continue to drive, as people all across the country, all across the West, despite the SNP's best efforts to pretend this is just a UK-based problem and it's all the Tories' fault. People are having to make decisions about whether or not to fill their car up. And if they do decide to fill their car up, how far do they fill the tank up, with petrol and diesel being as high as it is at present? And it's kind of putting people in a position, whether they realise it or not, where they're beginning to prioritise certain things over others. And, it stands to reason for some, not all, that less and less use of their car will become a reality. Under the impression it's temporary, but who's to say it is? Who's to say that they've not decided to just really up the ante and begin to accelerate progress towards decarbonisation already? It's very difficult to say, really.
The reliability of the kit at the moment is not what it should have been, so as Steve said, and getting access to the right people to make sure you keep the facilities up and running. Now, one of the things we've looked at is it actually easier when you have a large scale location? And as Steve said, equivalent to essentially a refueling station. So you're able to keep that ticking over. If you're going to choose to go and recharge your vehicle at that location, you have greater certainty that at least one of the charge points is going to be available. If you're driving to Lairg, for example, and there are only 2 points available, and they're both one's not working and the other one's already got a vehicle in it, that's where the range anxiety and the concerns start to kick in.
No matter what way you cut it, there isn't really a way around that, an issue like that at all. Because no matter how many charge ports they were to hypothetically create, let's just say there was 8 charge ports, all it would take is for the 9th car to get there. And because it's a long journey, they're taking the risk on board of whether or not there will be an available charge port. Then they arrive at their destination, and there's not. Okay, admittedly, they can sit and wait, but it's not exactly convenient, is it? And again, people are people. inconvenience will be taken on board. And over time, that will put people off. Or it might even put people off before they even consider purchasing an electric vehicle. Is it really worth it? Maybe they'll just stick to public transportation. You know? Because even if you are one of these people that ends up with an electric vehicle, as I said, you will still be limited to the charge ports they're placed.
Comes back to the balance, which I'm sure we're going to be getting onto, between whether it's better to encourage people with cars to switch to electric, or whether it's better to try to encourage people who've got cars now not to perhaps own their own car, but to use a mix of public transport and maybe join a car club.
Yeah, that's an idea we should be thinking about. Let's consider that thought. Should we be encouraging, quote-unquote, the public to ditch their car and rely more on public transportation? You know, that same public transportation that we're putting a hell of a lot of emphasis on, you know? Or maybe you should join a car club. Yeah. Or nannies actually own the car. You can't really go where you want, when you want.
They join a car club for the occasional longer trip they need to make.
Occasional.
Thank you, that's fascinating.
The cap and go, so you've got a capped level of payment per day, model that you have already in London. So those are things that are ongoing that you can really look to deliver in partnership. And I think that for us, the Bus Service Improvement Partnership is the best model where you can consider those things to provide that holistic approach. So you can access bus, but there's also, as you say, there's parking, safe parking for bike. There's walking routes to get there. The local authority with its role can really look to where those can be sited and have a strategic approach that delivers bus improvement alongside walking and cycling, so that you're really looking at those top tiers of the sustainable transport hierarchy and delivering for bus users as well as cyclists.
The challenges of the last couple of years of COVID, a lot of us have found that we can get things delivered to our homes and we can work from home. And that's had an impact in the last couple of years on the commuter market and on our access to retail. Whether that's going to continue, I think, is something that really does need thinking about. Is that something that, for example, the Scottish Government, the local authorities, actively want to encourage? The idea that people won't be going into their office jobs 9 to 5 days a week, but perhaps are only going in 1, 2 or 3 days.
Well, as I've played on this channel before, Nicola Thinlips has already kind of toyed that idea with the concept of hybrid working, which was ordinarily introduced as a sort of replacement to staying at home to work, stay-at-home working, or I can't actually recall the correct terminology there. But it was initially that, then they introduced this concept of hybrid working, which was about, at the time anyway, sort of easing people back into the work life, where the office space wouldn't be completely full like it used to be, but some people would be in on certain days, others would come in on the other days. Ordinarily, it was coined as a sort of temporary measure, again, emphasis on the easing back into the swing of things. It didn't take long before Nicola Thinlips was sat at her own committee, the video's on my channel somewhere, where she inevitably said what I'd been saying for some time on the channel anyway, and that was that we're starting to see people getting used to the idea of staying at home to work, and in many respects it's a good thing because it reduces our CO2 levels if there's less people travelling to and from work every day. Less people in the office means less CO2 in the air. So, colour me fucking shocked.
The scope for park and ride and perhaps for car clubs. I think that if people are working in city centres, if they're trying to get city centres, there's often a good case for encouraging them out of their vehicle before they get into the built-up area. That's where park and ride can work really well. It can provide secure parking. It could, in future, provide secure parking and a charging opportunity. So that's a win-win for people who are driving in. They can park their car, they can get it recharged, and they can get on a convenient and frequent bus service that gets them right into the centre of town, probably taking advantage of a whole host of bus priority measures that Paul will be telling us that we need to have. But we really need to think about whether the volume, the flow, is enough to sustain the service. And that's where the partnership between the local authority and the bus companies comes in, because if it were the case, and I can only postulate an if here, that office workers aren't going to be doing that 9 to 5, 5 days a week thing, the chances of that being an entirely commercial position are getting lower.
In the on-street electric vehicle charging infrastructure, how do you think it can be delivered without creating the obstacles for folk with mobility issues or sight loss, for example? My own house, outside my own house, has got an extremely large, wide pavement, and there's no way that right now that I could actually get an electric charging point outside my own place, and I don't have a street column beside my house either. So moving forward, how do you guys see that being delivered? If I could go to Steve first and then Ewan, please.
This is quite a challenge. So, as with so many of the things we've been talking about this morning, let's not pretend otherwise. This is difficult. I think that the last thing any of us wants to see is electric cables trailing across the footway. We've got enough problems maintaining our footways for people, whether they have sight issues, mobility issues. I think it sounds like that in your case, the chances are you're not going to be able to plug in from your house if you haven't got off-street parking that's really convenient.
And how many other people will be in a similar situation? You know? Especially people that live in blocks of flats, for example. Have they been taken into consideration? The bottom of cul-de-sacs, maybe mass charge ports at the end of each street. I think it's safe to assume that irrespective of whether or not this guy comes up with some sort of solution on the spot or suggestion on the spot, long term, the vast majority of these solutions will never pan out. They will never be brought to the forefront and implemented. It's safe to assume that if you don't have a house that's in an area where it's got the capability to host a charge point, you might have to write off the idea of having an electric vehicle, which again reduces the amount of people that will in time have one.
In answer to the previous question, I think I agreed with you on his point around budget. The two things I'd written down was budget and political will, and I think this question probably comes under the second category there, the latter, political will. I think demand management is an important tool. I think I gave evidence before on that 20% reduction in car kilometres, and I mentioned there would have to be sticks to go along with the carrots. Essentially, you need to look to manage demand and consider things like workplace parking levy, have a debate around congestion charging. I think local authorities should have those tools in the toolkit for where they're required. They won't be required in all local authorities, but there should be options that should be considered. And it's whether or not there's the political will there to have those difficult conversations. I think we saw some great progress in what I would call sort of small demand management interventions and sort of spaces for people where you have a look at road space reallocation and devote more to bus or active travel. Whilst there's been some negative headlines, I think overall that they've been hugely beneficial. So yeah, things if we're serious about net zero, probably overweighs the hopefully short-term negative reaction that these kind of demand management measures can bring.
Making that choice clear. What's the impact of that choice you're going to take in terms of the type of mode you're going to utilise? In terms of we already have, as authorities, the ability to vary our own parking charges. We're seeing now the opportunity for the use of workplace parking levies, so that's another tool that's available. And I would support what Paul said there in terms of the 20% reduction is ultimately a target that is going to be rolled out. It will focus the minds of local authorities in terms of how we're going to comply with that. Much about how we deal with the network in terms of streets, and we've seen lots of examples in terms of the potential to reduce the impact around schools, for example. So Edinburgh's did some really good work in terms of that. We're now back into the discussion about the role of 20 mile an hour as a tool for influencing choice as to where and when you travel, how you travel.
Percent reduction target be met without some of these demand management measures, or is some form of use of demand management going to have to be essential?
I think within city areas, in terms of I think it's really going to, yourselves and COSLA work very positively with Transport Scotland on this one. So there are definitely places where you can achieve that, and with softer measures than some of the harder, potentially less popular ones. The bigger challenges are going to be for those areas where there are fewer alternatives, for actually making that switch. So it may well be that the car.
Even the way that they're talking there, and they're talking about it as if we're lab rats in the third person, essentially. Measures whether or not they're hard or soft might be a bit more difficult in areas where there isn't a lot of alternatives to get us to make the quote-unquote switch. They're sat in committees talking about ways and suggesting and putting forth to each other a wee circle jerk, talking about methods to change our behaviour. That in and of itself is somewhat surreal. But when you think about where this is all going to lead to, it becomes somewhat bleak, dark even. We will have lost our ability to go wherever we want, essentially. You'll be limited to charge points.
Use financial measures. We have to recognise that although people using cars, by and large, are wealthier than some of our households, nevertheless, low-income households are going to be the first that impacted. We can't have office cleaners working from home. It just doesn't work. So we need to be thinking again, more broadly, if we're going to help those people, what's the complementary measure? If we're going to try to influence them not to use their own car, or perhaps to car share, or do something like that, what's the complementary measure that's going to help them financially over the hump, making the change? And that's not necessarily a complementary transport measure. That might be something in the social security system or in some other grant-giving system that enables those people to make a change to their lifestyle.
Public awareness campaigns. Carefully designed, of course, evidence-based awareness campaigns can help highlight the relevance of climate change to help people in Scotland, or to people in Scotland even, and play a role in encouraging action, encouragement yet again, changing your behaviour, encouraging you to do what's right. It goes on to say, marketing activity has an important role to play in raising awareness amongst individuals and organisations of the scale of change needed to tackle climate change. The policies being developed by the government to respond to climate change at home and overseas, and the role of government organisations and individuals in getting Scotland to net zero. Whilst climate change is largely embedded in the public consciousness, new and compelling narratives are required. New and compelling narratives are required. Oh, is that right? We need new, repetitive, compelling narratives to run frequently. When one dies a death, another one is born, and they have to be there time after time after time to ensure that that sense of urgency doesn't dissipate. And then it says, building climate change narratives that resonate with a diverse range of viewpoints is critical for the long-term goal of deepening public engagement. Deepening public engagement via the methodology of building climate change narratives. Providing information about the lifestyle changes we need to make can help increase uptake. We know it is vital that people see their individual actions within the context of the bigger picture. If individuals and organisations feel they're tackling this alone, it's easy to lose heart. It's important that we showcase the work done by government and other organisations across Scotland to tackle climate change, to help build belief in the importance of individual action in supporting the transition. That's why in 2021 they launched the new national marketing campaign, Let's Do Net Zero. Yes, we all see Nicola Thinlips walking about with the face masks, or the proverbial face mask I should say. Now it's the Ukrainian shit that was plastered all over the side, but for a time there it was Let's Do Net Zero. That was the catchphrase of the day. But it's interesting there. It's all about the the government there. There's an emphasis on work being done by the government and other organisations. It's important that that's showcased. Yeah, well, maybe you should start by cancelling your current election campaign, driving about Scotland in your diesel guzzling yellow bus with your fucking face plastered on the side of it. And while you're not in the bus travelling around Scotland to woo whomever will be there to meet you as you waddle off, you're getting chauffeur driven around Glasgow in a limo. While simultaneously other SNP MSPs are building up quite a pretty penny in terms of taxpayers' money, getting chauffeur driven from A to B. And this has been quite a phenomenon for some time. It's very bizarre for people who insist that we must consider changing our behaviour, adapting our behaviour, and maybe decide not to comply. They will just begin to put financial constraints into place. It's all very well and good for these people to say these things while simultaneously they don't act that way themselves. Okay. Anyway. Yeah, okay. Anyway. To inform people about the climate emergency, the opportunity to raise climate change to the top of the agenda. Oh yeah, exactly. Showcasing the progress Scotland has already made on tackling climate change while reinforcing the message that significant work is still to be done. Well, we've got plenty of time before the next COP, the world's hanging by a thread, but they've got plenty of time to kill. We can wait patiently till the next COP. We are planning to run similar campaigns on a regular basis, evaluating campaign activity to understand its reach and impact, and will apply learning to future marketing activity. Also committing to including children and young people in future marketing research to ensure their voices are heard. And there it is again. Sage were actively involved in attempting to some degree, change people's behaviour in order to get them to comply with the measures in place for the benefit of our health, of course. But the fact is that we were all told that was occurring and people still complied with it regardless. That was baffling in and of itself. But you fast forward to where we are now, and we're in a brand new quote-unquote crisis for the time being. But the old tropes regarding climate change and what needs to be done, they haven't gone away, but they just seem to be very, very, very eerily similar to what we would need to do in order to see us through the current quote-unquote crisis. It's very, very bizarre. Like this website here, which was one of the hyperlinks on the previous page I was just on. Scotland, let's do net zero. And then it goes on to say that we must all play a part in tackling the so-called climate emergency, climate change, by making changes to how we travel. Well, we were doing that during COVID. What we buy, well, reducing our waste, changing how we use energy at home. Well, people are on the fringes of not having much of a choice in that regard at present, unless they earn a lot of money. We can help to reduce net zero emissions by 2045 if we do all of this.
And the next topic is youth voice, which is a great and important topic. And Anna will be speaking about that and asking those questions.
Thanks, Michaela. This is a really important topic for us, especially considering the recent passing of children's rights into Scots law.
Well, it wasn't passed, was it? Not that stopped anybody from educating you as if it has been, but nonetheless.
This means that amongst lots of other rights, children and young people have the right to be heard on issues that are important to them and the right to the best possible health, including a clean environment.
Yeah, that's right. So naturally, that's the right that I always refer to in regards to having the right to be heard and taken seriously, but you've got the right to a clean environment. And then there's also the right that I think has got to be the most cleverly inserted right of them all, and that is they have a right to learn their rights. So by and large, teachers in time when this is officially enshrined in law will be forced to introduce children to the UNCRC and all that it entails. But again, it's just another example of why this is an absolute red herring, because these rights are promoted and talked about, and in time will be enshrined into law. They act as if it's already been done, and that it brings with it inevitably climate change talk, which opens the door to all the things I mentioned previously. Oh, God.
It is really important that those, like youth workers, who support many of us young people to have our voices heard, continue to have politician support, especially throughout the climate crisis which our generation will have to deal with. Like me, lots of other young people watching will not yet be old enough to vote in this election, yet we are taking action because we know that the climate crisis is an issue that will affect all of our lives.
And what action would that be like? Oh, God.
The first question for the Youth Voice topic comes from Jack, 18, from Perth and Kinross. Young people across Scotland and the world have become more aware of politics, climate justice and the climate crisis.
And how would that come into effect? Well, that's because part of the curriculum for excellence in terms of Scotland anyway, I can't speak for anywhere else, in Scotland, part of it is introducing them to the concept of politics. So it's essentially shaping them to become good global citizens. It's shaping them to be able to make an impact and influence the world in later life. It's politicised to high heaven. But fundamentally, had they not been introduced to these topics, had the mainstream media not been talking about it to no end, had politicians not been talking about it to no end, and had our education system not taken it upon themselves, obviously endorsed to etc., and the mainstream media to introduce children to these talking points, had none of these things occurred, then these children would not have anything of worth to say. And by and large, half of them don't have anything of worth to say anyway. All they're realistically doing is reiterating what they have been presented with.
And we are more eager than ever to have our voices heard and listened to. How will you ensure...
There's always this emphasis on being listened to, because again, this is UNCRC rhetoric. Had they not been introduced to any of these talking points, why the fuck would anybody listen to them? No offence. And by design, of course, everybody knows that. But the children are there to be seen and not heard, as the expression goes. We're not really there to hear tidbits and insightful opinions and information about climate change from children who are literally just reiterating what they've been taught in the fucking classroom. Had they not even been taught that in the classroom, then they wouldn't have an opinion at all.
That any engagement that you have with young people is frequent, meaningful, and leads to action. If you would like to
action, meaningful, frequent, and leads to action. So what? The children, they're so self-empowered, you know, metaphorical smoke blown up their arses, where they think that they can just demand meetings willy-nilly with the government and question the cabinet. They get one a year, you know, it's more than most get, you know, and they demand action, and every single time action has to be taken. Okay. Well, I'm sure if that's the case and the government were to hypothetically agree to that, what would inevitably occur is they would just carefully craft the next couple of textbooks that you'll be provided with.
I sometimes say hope is hard work, but it's necessary work. You have to work hard at being hopeful, because the alternative is to give up. I've been really privileged to be invited to speak at a number of the youth climate strike demos, and it's an extraordinary atmosphere, because I know how much my generation owes you an apology.
Oh, fucking hell. Here we go. Like, here comes the false sense of empowerment again. I mean, this is all like bog standard textbook grade grooming. You're reaffirming the shit that they get taught in school. You're reaffirming their narrative, their delusion, their worldview, the worldview that you yourself have played a part in creating for them. Your generation's failed them, yeah? Oh, well, that's that then. So what? As a result of your generation failing her generation, what needs to be done then? We need to actively encourage her generation to continue to shout to the rooftops for imminent action to be taken. Yeah. Oh my God.
A deep apology, because your generation has a right to feel angry and to feel impatient. So, you know, I don't want to. I think it would sound arrogant to say, you know, I'm going to listen to young people, and I want to be inspired, yes, but I want you to embarrass me and my generation at how we have failed you, and I struggle to put into words how deep that apology needs to run. I do know that the Scottish Young Greens, for example, are about to run their first Climate Citizens Assembly. They're, you know, I hope going to be that. I hope that's the kind of conversation that you and many of the people in the audience are going to want to engage in. Job, because we failed you.
a citizens' assembly on climate for the under-16s, similar to the climate assembly that we've had running over recent months. I've met myself with climate strikers before the COVID pandemic struck. It's not been as easy to do it since then. But actually, I think this question is the wrong way around, to be honest. I don't think it should be about politicians deciding how they're going to engage with young people or how they're going to listen to young people. As young people, you shouldn't give us the choice. You should be absolutely banging down our doors if you don't think we're listening, if you don't think we're engaging, and more importantly, if you don't think we're taking the action that we have to be taken. And that's what I think is so hopeful about the climate youth movement, the climate strikes, is that young people have made clear they're not prepared to, not be heard, and they're not prepared for politicians just to sort of drag their heels any longer. I think Patrick's right. I think your generation should be fizzing mad with my generation and those that have come before. We've let you down. We have abused the planet for too long. And that's what I think is so hopeful about the climate youth movement, the climate strikes, is that young people have made clear they're not prepared to, not be heard, and they're not prepared for politicians just to sort of drag their heels any longer. I think Patrick's right. I think your generation should be fizzing mad with my generation and those that have come before. We've let you down. We have abused the planet for too long, and we now have left you in a position where it's a race against time to sort that. And as long as
a race against time, she says so confidently, no concern in the voice whatsoever. And again, as I said earlier on, COP, for example, they can wait once a year for COP to take place. Surely, if there was an impending doom right around the corner, these things would be agreed a lot sooner. But again, it's this false sense of empowerment. You're filling these children's heads with shit, encouraging them to continue to pain and strike and advocate for change, demand change, and you get to play the role of the government that's having their feet held to the fire, of a government that feels compelled to implement imminent action due to guilt.
Have to become part of that, not as spectators, not as people lobbying us, but actually as participants. And that's participants, I think, on a few different levels. So quite often people think, politicians are the only one making decisions on this. Actually, I think of it as a three-part. One is direct politics in terms of elected politics, and we need much more diverse voices in direct politics. Second is also in our civil service. So many of the decision-making happens around our civil service. We need young people engaging in our civil service. And the third part is media. So much of what shapes our priorities, so much what shapes our reaction is around what happens on media, traditional forms of media, and on social media. That's where we need to hear voices in Parliament, in the civil service, in media, on issues like the climate emergency, but also other issues as well last year. So hold our feet to the fire on all of these issues.
Hold our feet to the fire.
Thanks, Anas. The right to have a say goes hand in hand with the right to education and accurate information, and this question is really important to us. It was developed by the young people who attended the warm-up event. How will you ensure that young people have compulsory environment and climate education at school?
I wonder how they came to that conclusion. Could it be that they're presented with talking points during their sustainability lessons, where it's essentially laid out for them that there currently isn't a specific climate change talking point or a specific climate change topic included within the curriculum? So naturally the light bulb, Alan Smith style, goes off in their heads where they think, well, we could change that. Let's advocate for it. That needs to change immediately. That's outrageous.
I would like to start with Douglas.
And education is such an important issue on all of these issues going forward. I also, just as again an extension of that, is I actually think we should have a climate focus on every single portfolio that we have across the whole of government.
There's been a lot more discussion and awareness recently about the way in which we need to face up to the past on issues like racism and colonialism, and a desire to look again at what we're teaching. We need to think just as deeply about teaching the future. Your adult lives are going to be defined by an era in human history that is fundamentally shaped by the climate and nature emergencies.
We need to be careful about is that doesn't then lead to, climate education becoming pigeonholed as a sort of discrete subject that doesn't have a connection into every other part of the curriculum. Curriculum for Excellence is meant to be about educating informed citizens that understand the world around them and understand their place in the world and how they shape the world curriculum as well. And I think we need to embed it more and make it much, much more mainstream.
So before this goes any further, bear in mind that due to the UNCRC, according to that girl herself, it's already been enshrined in law. It's not, but it was going to be. But the UNCRC effectively introduces children to climate change education. Learning for Sustainability does the same thing. Global Citizenship does the same thing. All this shit does the same thing. So by and large, in part, the children are introduced to some degree about climate change, right? They then get to a position where they are propagandized enough, where they start to become politically active, aka the climate strikes, or whether that be some getting involved with the Children's Parliament, whatever it may be. But so many of them inevitably come to the conclusion that there needs to be things put in place to make climate change education compulsory. Then we have the government doing the proverbial head bobbing routine, where they sit and pretend to give a fuck about what the children are saying, knowing damn well that all they're doing is effectively regurgitating what they've been taught to think. They get to do the head bobbing routine and pretend that they're going to take what's been said on board. They're going to take what these children are suggesting to them on board.
I think it's really important that young people learn about the causes of climate change and the climate emergency.
Which in and of itself is fucking evil, because the narrative because for the longest time the debate was not one-sided. There was not consensus. The science was not settled. In fact, there was quite a lot to suggest that the narrative that was being put forth by the likes of your Patrick Harveys and your United Nations, etc., was a load of shit. That's all been buried now. A climate crisis, quote-unquote, was declared. Now they've got carte blanche to justify burying any dissenting opinions, and now they're actively talking about educating children on the factors of climate change and what causes it. And of course they're going to teach the children, not that they don't already know anyway, but it's all because of CO2 and that pesky industrial revolution. That's what they'll be taught. That's what they are taught. That's the consensus.
Climate emergency, the ecological crisis, a core part of teacher training, so that actually teachers are being educated in a way that then allows them to contribute to one of these things where we have to have a really kind of fundamental look at, how we design the curriculum to make sure it is just a mainstreamed, accepted part of everything that happens in a school. So I think this is one of the hardest issues, I think, for politicians in Scotland. The North Sea oil and gas industry has been for such a long time such an important part of our economy, and there's lots of jobs depend on it, but that does not get anybody off the hook in terms of the climate imperative of moving away from reliance on fossil fuels. I want us to end our reliance on fossil fuels as quickly as we possibly can, but we've got to focus on what it takes to do that. We're already in a position in Scotland where just short of 100% of our electricity comes from renewable sources, but we've got to repeat that when it comes to transport. We've got to replicate that in terms of how we heat our houses and buildings, and all of our manifestos, I think, are full of what we're going to do around that. And we do have to make sure that we're not abandoning people who currently rely on that industry for jobs.
We're looking at, I'm not hearing a clear timescale from anybody else. And at the end of the day, we cannot negotiate with the climate. You cannot say to the climate, but please, we need the jobs. That doesn't cut it. So the timescale has to be set by the science. And what the science says is that we cannot burn the stuff that we've already found. We can't burn more than a third of it. So let's stop kidding ourselves. The end date of the very last drop is much less important than the scale of moving away from it now.
Hi everyone, so my name is Dylan. I'm a 16-year-old climate and environmental activist from West Lothian, and I went on strike from school for the climate in February 2019, and I've continued to do that every single Friday since. So leading on from what we talked about earlier with young people being engaged in climate change, I want you all to take a second to process what that actually means. Every single Friday for 123 weeks consecutively, I have refused to focus on my education and instead dealt with a problem that you should have dealt with. We're still not dealing with it. If the comments here have shown us anything, young people don't agree that you've done what is necessary either. Our education doesn't come close to covering the severity of climate change. Higher geography even teaches the benefits of climate change, and many schools don't even have
because there's not any benefits at all, none whatsoever, to this hypothetical climate crisis. But again, see if I was one of those politicians sat there having to listen to this little shit. I gave the green light for the textbooks to be put in front of that individual. Not to mention the fact that they go on to talk about the totally organic climate strikes that have been endorsed by not just the mainstream media, but by the government themselves on a multitude of occasions. I've refused to do my education on a convenient day, is it not? Sure, there's many other children that are joining you outside. If they're not rehearsing what they've learnt in school, they're just there for the ride. But nonetheless, sense of entitlement, politically groomed, and this is the end product, where they think that they're saying things to these politicians that they don't already fucking know.
Environmental science as an available subject. To the point of specifically climate change, which this next section is about, our carbon budget gives us about 6 to 9 years of current emissions to stay below 1.5 degrees. I will be at most 25 years old then.
Even this notion of 1.5 degrees irritates me. Have an impact on the climate's one thing, but what happens if we were able to stabilize and ensure that we didn't go over the 1.5? Is it going to remain at 1.5 for eternity from there then on out? Or is at some point going to cross the minds of Mr. He, Him, Dylan that, that the planet, the climate itself, it fluctuates, temperatures rise, they fall, things change, ice ages, heat waves for long periods of time, nothing is static, nothing remains in place for eternity. So even the idea of getting to a point where we can ensure that we don't go above 1.5, for how long does that last?
Just be out of my education and entering my adult life.
To step up and do more and stop failing you. And I think it's important to recognise that. To come to the question though, so Scotland's climate change targets right now are they are sufficient. If the whole world had the same targets as Scotland and met those targets, the world would do enough to meet the Paris Agreement of keeping, global warming below 1.5 degrees. So part of what we need to play our part in trying to achieve at COP26 in Glasgow is making sure that the world actually comes up with binding agreements that will deliver the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. To do that, we're not an independent country, but we're going to choose to do that, to set out exactly what Scotland is going to do to meet those targets. I think there are aspects of Scotland's targets that I think are important beyond the headline commitment, 2045, net zero, ending our contribution to climate change. Actually, the 2030 75% target is probably more important in the short term because that forces the pace of action that is required. We also have annual emissions targets that help to force that change as well. So I think that is about making sure that it's not a 2045 well into the future target that people like us think, well, we've got plenty of time. The change is being forced and driven now. What we're going to do, we have to replicate what we've done in electricity across every other aspect of the way we live our lives. We've got to decarbonise transport. That absolutely means electric and low emission vehicles, but it means reducing our reliance on cars.
Those are appalling decisions. We need to be committing to make sure that we're an open, generous contributor to the world on these issues. But underneath those narrow kind of technical issues about how we do stuff, there is a really, really big issue that we don't talk about enough. Capitalism is an economic system which is geared specifically to extracting resource, both from people and from the planet, and turning it into profit. It's an incredibly efficient machine for extracting resource and turning it into profit. It's incredibly inefficient at distributing that profit fairly to meet everybody's needs.
Fairly. Fuck's sake. It's unbelievable. Oh, God. That Nicola Thinlips, in particular, wants to implement an economy that's identical to the question itself is predicated on.
COVID. Will party leaders embrace the opportunity to create an economic system whose indicators of success represent the health of the people and our planet, rather than prioritising GDP growth, which is depleting natural resources at an ever-increasing rate? We'll go to Nicola Sturgeon first.
Nicola Thinlips.
In a word, yes. I mean, the answer to that question is bigger and more complicated, but I've got a lot of sympathy with what Patrick has just said there about not chasing GDP growth all of the time and making that the sole metric of success or failure in the economy. We want to see Scotland have a well-being economy. We want to see our budgets basically determined by not just economic metrics, but are we a healthy, happy, fulfilled population? We're about everything there that we need to do to meet the climate and the ecological crisis that we face, and you need to absolutely hold us to that. I agree with Patrick, and this will be my final point. I think this is a pivotal moment. COVID has disrupted everything, and when things fall apart, you get to choose how you put them back together, and we shouldn't put them back together the way they were before. This is a moment where we can do things differently. Everybody talks about an investment-led green recovery. I think we're all agreed on that. We have to deliver it, but tackling the inequalities that are endemic in our society, that has to be one of the other big things we do as we come out of this. So words...
Sounds exactly like sustainable developments.